The Arizona Territory's sun bore down on Ash Fork Crossing like molten iron poured from God's own forge. August 1874, and the drought had turned the settlement's main street into a ribbon of cracked earth that radiated heat in visible waves. Greta Anderson stood atop a shipping crate stamped "Dry Goods Prescott," her wrists bound with hemp rope that had already worn her skin raw and bloody. 25 years old, blonde hair dark with sweat and dust, she kept her spine rigid even as her legs trembled beneath her torn calico dress. Around her, 24 men had gathered, miners with rifles slung casual over shoulders, cowhands with sun-scorched faces, shopkeepers wiping palms on aprons. Their eyes assessed her with the same cold calculation they'd use for livestock at market. $5. Conrad Anderson's voice cracked across the crowd, desperation thickening his Swedish accent. His gray beard was unkempt suspenders, holding up trousers patched at both knees. $5 for 3 months' labor. She cooks sows, works harder than any man here. Greta's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. She recognized most of these faces, men who'd tipped hats to her after Sunday services just weeks ago, before Conrad's debts to Harlan Pike had swallowed the last shreds of decency. That morning replayed in her mind like a nightmare. Conrad had grabbed her arm as she'd prepared breakfast, his fingers bruising through fabric. "Du är skyldig mig allt." He'd snarled in a mixture of Swedish and something else German, she realized now. "I pulled you from that cholera camp, from those pastors who would have shipped you east to an orphanage. You owe me everything." She'd tried to pull away, but he'd been stronger, dragging her to the wagon despite her struggles. Now she stood here displayed like merchandise, while the settlement decided her worth. A ranch foreman named Buck Wiley stepped forward, spurs jangling with each deliberate step. He pulled a belt knife from its sheath, the blade throwing light like a signal mirror. "Reckon I'll mark this purchase proper," he drawled, reaching for Greta's thick blonde braid. "A man's gotta know what he owns." His calloused fingers grabbed the plait and yanked her head back violently. Pain shot down her neck like lightning. The knife edge touched just below her ear, beginning to saw through hair. A thin line of blood appeared where the blade nicked skin. "Wait!" The single word cut through the crowd's murmur like a gunshot through glass. Every head turned as one. A man pushed through the gathered settlers, Lakota, perhaps 28, wearing buckskin trousers and moccasins, his bare chest marked with old scars that spoke of survival. What drew every eye was the awoven headband set with a single white plume, an understated sign of peaceful intent. Dakota. Greta had seen him twice before trading furs at Pike's Mercantile, always keeping to the edges, always watching with eyes that missed nothing. Now he walked straight toward the crate, carrying a rolled bundle of pelts under one muscled arm. "This auction is wrong." Dakota said his English clear and unaccented in a way that seemed to surprise several onlookers. Conrad's face flushed dark red. "No concern of yours, savage. This is family business, legal and proper under territorial law." Family does not sell family. Dakota's dark eyes moved to Greta, holding her gaze with an intensity that felt like a lifeline thrown across deep water. She is a person, not livestock to be traded. Buck kept the knife pressed to Greta's braid, but his eyes had narrowed on Dakota with the particular wariness of a man who'd learned to recognize danger. "You got $5.01 Indian." Dakota dropped his bundle of furs on the packed earth. With a soft thump that raised a small cloud of dust, 20 beaver pelts, at least winter thick and prime, worth $30 easy at any trading post from here to California. Then he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a silver pocket watch, tarnished but clearly intact, and laid it carefully atop the furs with the reverence of a man placing down everything he owned. All of it. More than $5. More than anyone here will offer for a human being. The street went silent, except for wind rattling loose boards on Pike's mercantile and land office across the way. Then, slow mocking applause echoed from the building's shaded porch, each strike of palm on palm loud and deliberate and laced with contempt. Harlan Pike emerged from shadow into brutal sunlight, thumbs hooked in his vest pockets. A tall man in his early 40s, clean-shaven despite the frontier fashion for beards, wearing a tailored wool suit despite heat that would have killed a lesser man, and the only prosperous-looking soul in Ashfork Crossing. His boots clicked on wooden steps as he descended to street level with the confidence of a king surveying his kingdom. Well now, this is genuine theater. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes, that spoke of calculations made and opportunities recognized. But I'm afraid the auction has reserved terms, Mr. Dakota. $5 cash money or equivalent trade goods that I personally determine acceptable as the primary creditor. And Mr. Anderson here owes me considerably more than $30 in seed tools, equipment, land credit extension, and accumulated interest. Sheriff Orrin Hale detached himself from the crowd like a remora from a shark hand resting on his holstered Colt, with the practiced ease of a man who'd drawn it many times and would draw it many more. Heavy set with a tin star pinned slightly crooked on his vest, he'd been Pike's bought man since the day Pike had paid his gambling bond in Tucson 2 years back, a debt that could never be fully repaid. The auction's legal under territorial indenture labor statutes. Dakota, you best move along before there's trouble nobody in this settlement wants to see. Dakota's eyes never left Greta's face, as if Pike and Hale and the entire watching crowd had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. What do you say? He asked her directly, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable across the hot, still air. Do you consent to this sale? Greta's throat was so tight she could barely breathe, much less speak. No one had asked her consent about anything, not about coming west with Conrad as a child, with memories so fragmented she couldn't trust them. Not about working his failing farm year after year. Not about standing on this crate under the pitiless sun since she could remember. Her voice came out hoarse but steady, each word costing her something she couldn't name but knew was precious. No. Then I stand witness she refuses before all gathered here. First refusal makes this auction void under common law. Pike's smile vanished like water thrown on desert sand. He gave Buck a small nod, barely perceptible but unmistakable in its intent. Buck pressed the knife harder against Greta's braid metal, biting. The girl's father has legal right under territorial custody law. Adoptive father. Dakota interrupted, his tone still calm, but with iron underneath, now steel showing through silk. I heard the story at trading posts, where men speak freely to someone they think beneath notice. Stockholm orphan brought over in '55 after her parents died of trail cholera. She is not his blood. She is 25 years of age, an adult woman. She can refuse. Conrad's face went white as sun-bleached bone, all the blood draining away. How do you, who told you that's not? People talk. Dakota said simply, almost gently. Especially to someone who listens instead of commands. Especially when those people think in Lakota won't understand their business or won't care about their town's dirty secrets. Greta's heart was pounding so hard now that she could feel her pulse in her temples, in her wrists, where the rope cut deep in her throat, where words had caught like fish bones. The nick on her neck stung with each bead of sweat that rolled into it, and she could feel blood trickling down in a warm line toward her collar, staining the faded calico darker. But Dakota's presence, his absolute certainty, his refusal to look away, gave her something she hadn't felt in 19 years' hope. I refuse, Greta said louder this time, forcing the words out in English so every witness would hear and understand, and could never later claim ignorance. I will not be sold like cattle or furniture or tools. I am a person, and I refuse. Pike's hand twitched toward the inside of his coat, where Greta knew he kept a small pistol she'd seen it once, when she delivered Conrad's payment and Pike had been careless. Hale's palm dropped fully onto his revolver grip, fingers curling around worn wooden handle. Buck Wiley's knife began to move again, angle shifting for a deeper cut. Meant to mark and claim, Dakota's hand shot out with the speed of a striking snake and caught Buck's wrist in an iron grip, fingers closing like a trap sprung. He twisted hard mechanics, precise and brutal. Buck's face contorted in pain and shock, and the knife clattered onto the crate at Greta's feet with a sound like a bell tolling. Dakota kicked it smoothly, efficiently, sending the blade skittering across a packed earth to disappear under a tied horse that sidestepped nervously, the whites of its eyes showing stark against brown. Enough of this mockery. Pike's shout rang out across the street, shattering the moment's frozen tension. He pulled papers from inside his coat with shaking hands. Land deeds, debt notes, all the careful documentation of Conrad's slow financial strangulation compiled over 3 years. Oren, arrest this man immediately for interfering with lawful commerce, threatening citizens with a deadly weapon, and assault on Mr. Wiley. A rifle shot cracked the air like breaking thunder, so sudden and loud that Greta's ears rang. Everyone ducked by pure animal instinct, bodies moving before minds could process. The bullet splintered the porch post 2 feet behind Pike, with a sound like snapping bones, sending wood chips flying in a spray of pale splinters. A young cowhand's carbine was smoking in his trembling hands. He'd been gesturing carelessly with it when someone in the panicking crowd had jostled his arm hard and the weapon had discharged. His face went pale as milk eyes wide. Accident, blast it all. I didn't mean to, I swear, But the damage was catastrophically, irrevocably done. The horse that Buck's knife had slid under reared with a terrified neigh that cut through the air like a woman's scream-iron-shod hooves smashing down onto the crate Greta stood on with the force of hammers on anvil. Wood cracked with a sound like breaking bones, sharp and final, and the crate tilted violently sideways, 45 degrees in an instant. Greta stumbled, bound hands, unable to catch herself or grab for any kind of balance. Dakota's arm circled her waist like an iron band, and he pulled her bodily off the collapsing crate, lifting her clear. They hit the ground together, hard enough to drive the air from both their lungs, rolling his body positioned to take the worst of the impact. For one suspended heartbeat, they lay tangled behind a water trough as 2 more shots rang out. Pike's men firing at shadows and movement panic spreading like wildfire through dry grass through the crowd. Dust churned as horses stamped and reared and screamed. Men shouted contradictory orders. Someone was crying. The world had gone mad in the space between one breath and the next. "Can you run?" Dakota's breath was warm against Greta's ear, his body angled to shield hers from the chaos erupting around them from stray bullets and trampling hooves. His heart beat hard and fast against her shoulder blade. Greta's mind was racing like a runaway horse. Conrad had the key to the rope binding her wrists somewhere on his person, but Dakota's knife was already sawing through the hemp with quick, efficient strokes that spoke of practice. She felt the last tough fiber part, and suddenly her hands were free for the first time in 3 hours that had felt like 3 lifetimes. She rubbed her wrists hard, wincing at the raw burns, feeling blood return to her fingers in painful tingles like 1,000 tiny knives. "Can you run?" Dakota repeated with more urgency, now his eyes scanning the chaos for threats and opportunities. Behind them, boots were pounding Hale's voice, bellowing for order that would never come. Pike screaming for someone, anyone to stop them before they disappeared. Greta looked into Dakota's eyes at the absolute certainty burning there, like banked coals, and the lack of hesitation or doubt, or the crushing weight of impossible odds. No man had ever asked her if she could do something hard, and then waited for her answer as if it mattered as if her assessment of her own capabilities had value. They told her to do simple things and expected obedience. Without question, cook this clean. Let's stay quiet, don't ask, accept your place. But Dakota was asking if she had the strength for something that required courage she wasn't sure she possessed. If you lead, Greta answered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. I'll follow. They ran. Dakota pulled her left into the narrow alley between Pike's Mercantile and the assayer's office, their boots kicking up small explosions of dust with each pounding step. The passage was barely wide enough for a man sideways, forcing them to move single-file Greta behind Dakota, his hand gripping hers and pulling her forward. Behind them, another shot boomed, and Greta heard the bullet punch into the Mercantile's wall somewhere above her head with a thunk like an axe into wood. They burst out the far side into the open prairie, beyond the settlement's ragged edge, where the land rolled away in waves of yellow grass and exposed red earth that shimmered in the heat like water that would never quench thirst. The sun was an anvil beating down on them. The air burned in Greta's lungs like she was breathing fire instead of oxygen. She'd been fed poorly for weeks as Conrad spent every penny on whiskey instead of food, and now her body was screaming at the sudden, brutal exertion in heat that could kill. But she kept pace through sheer will, grabbing her longer skirts in one hand to hike them high enough to run properly, determination and pure survival instinct, replacing fear with something harder and cleaner. Dakota risked a glance backward without slowing. 6 riders were mounting up back at the settlement, Hale in the lead, on a big roan-gelding Buck Wiley beside him, despite his injured wrist, and 4 deputized townsmen behind them, looking scared but determined. They'd be in rifle range within 2 minutes on this open ground, with no cover except a line of scraggly cottonwoods half a mile ahead, marking where the dry creek bed cut through the valley like an old scar. Then the wind shifted direction suddenly, and with it came salvation of a terrible sort. A wall of dust rose on the southern horizon, like a living creature from nightmare, one of the sudden dust devils that could blind a man at 50 paces and strip skin if you were caught without shelter. It swept toward them with frightening speed that defied belief, fed by the drought-dry soil and the temperature differential between superheated ground and slightly cooler air masses above nature's fury made visible. Down. Dakota pulled Greta into a shallow depression where spring runoff had carved a temporary gully during wetter times, now bone dry, and offering just enough depth to provide minimal shelter. They pressed flat against yielding earth that still held heat from the day, making themselves as small as possible as the dust devil roared overhead, with a sound like 1,000 freight trains bearing down at once. Sand stung every inch of exposed skin, like being flayed by invisible knives. Greta buried her face hard against Dakota's shoulder, his arm automatically covering her head and neck, his body angled to take the brunt of the flying grit and debris that could blind or choke. The thunder of pursuing hoofbeats passed somewhere to their right, confused shouts muffled and distorted by the howling wind that turned the world into brown chaos. When the dust finally cleared enough to see 30 feet instead of 3 to breathe without choking, the riders were gone, scattered in the confusion, or circled away in the wrong direction, entirely searching blind for quarry that had vanished like ghosts. Dakota helped Greta to her feet with a hand under her elbow, his touch gentle despite the urgency. Her dress was torn worse now, already threadbare fabric shredded further by brush and the headlong flight, but her eyes were absolutely clear. No shock, no paralysis, no surrender, just fierce focus. Where? She asked, simply trusting him to know the land in a way she never could. He pointed toward the cottonwoods with his chin. Dry creek bed. We follow it north 3 miles, and there's an old stamp mill abandoned since the silver played out. We can rest there, tend wounds, figure out what comes next. We. The question was genuine, not challenging, but carrying weight. Dakota met her eyes steadily. You have somewhere else to go, someone else who'll stand between you and Pike. Greta glanced back toward Ash Fork Crossing, where Pike's mercantile rose above the other buildings like a fortress tower or a gallows. Conrad would be there now, probably collecting his blood money from a very angry Pike, or more likely drinking it away at the saloon before sunset, while Pike planned his next move with the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on others' suffering. The homestead she'd known for 19 years had never been a home in any real sense, just a place she'd endured day by day, surviving, waiting for something to change, without ever truly believing it actually would. No, she said quietly, the word carrying finality. I don't. They ran again, this time toward something uncertain instead of just away from something certain, and somehow that made all the difference in the world. The cottonwoods provided sparse shade but critical cover from watching eyes. Greta and Dakota dropped into the dry creek bed where exposed limestone bedrock created a shallow culvert beneath the gnarled roots of the largest tree roots that had dug deep, searching for water that no longer came. Above them, the sun continued its merciless arc across a sky bleached, nearly colorless, by heat and drought. Sweat soaked through everything, stinging in cuts and scrapes. Dakota scanned the shimmering prairie behind them, with eyes narrowed against the glare, reading the land like other men read books. Dust still hung in the air from the riders' confused search, but the sounds of pursuit had faded eastward. Hale was likely assuming they'd make for the hills where there were caves and year-round springs. He turned to assess Greta properly for the first time since they'd stopped moving. She sat with her back against the limestone chest, heaving dress plastered to her skin, blonde hair escaping its pins in wild tangles that caught dust and turned it to mud with sweat. Her neck wound had stopped bleeding but left a dried, rust-colored trail. But what struck him hardest was her expression, not the fear or panic or helpless terror he'd expect from someone who'd just been auctioned and nearly scalped, but cold calculation. She was thinking, planning mind already moving past what had happened to what would come next. She was a survivor. They'll check here eventually, she said, when her breathing steadied enough to speak, without gasping, her voice rough but controlled. This is known cover for anyone running from town. Every outlaw and drunk is hidden here. Yes, but not first. Dakota untied his small pack of supplies that had somehow stayed with him through everything, years of practice keeping essentials close. He pulled out a leather water skin and offered it to Greta first, without hesitation. She drank carefully, rationing instinctively, not greedily, despite obvious desperate thirst, then handed it back with a small nod of thanks that spoke of old hunger and forced discipline. Hale thinks like a lawman, not a tracker. Dakota continued drinking sparingly himself. He'll search the obvious escape routes first. The Prescott Road, the mining camps up in the hills, maybe the stagecoach relay station at Bitter Springs. This buys us time. Maybe until nightfall if we're lucky. Time for what? It was the right question, cutting straight to the heart of their impossible situation. Dakota drank again, then corked the water skin and set it aside carefully. Pike will not let this rest. He cannot afford to. If Lakota can disrupt his auction in front of witnesses in broad daylight, others might start questioning his authority. Start wondering if his power is as absolute as he claims. He'll call it kidnapping, get Hale to write up proper-looking reports for the territorial marshal in Prescott. Post bounty notices. Make an example. Is it kidnapping? Greta asked, directly meeting his eyes. You refused consent before witnesses. Multiple witnesses. I acted to prevent unlawful restraint of an unwilling person. But Pike owns Hale, and Hale writes the official reports that go to Prescott and become legal record. In those reports, he let the implication hang heavy between them. Greta absorbed this with a kind of grim practicality that made her seem older than 25, aged by hardship, into something harder than circumstances should have forged. Then we need leverage. Something that makes hunting us cost more than letting us disappear into the territories. Dakota studied her with growing respect that bordered on awe. You think tactically. I think survival, Greta corrected. Conrad taught me exactly one useful thing in 19 years: how to be underestimated. How to be invisible while still being useful. Men assume women don't plan beyond the next meal or the next darning. It creates opportunities if you're smart enough to use them and patient enough to wait. A distant sound made them both freeze instantly. Bodies going absolutely still, hoofbeats, perhaps a quarter-mile south along the creek bed's winding path. They pressed deeper into the culvert without conscious thought, barely breathing, making themselves small and silent as the sound grew marginally closer, then began to fade. Two riders passed slowly along the opposite bank, too far to make out details clearly through the heat shimmer, but close enough to represent immediate deadly danger if either rider changed direction or decided to investigate the cottonwood grove. One wore a Confederate gray hat, Buck Wiley, unmistakable, even at this distance, by that relic of a war 5 years dead. The other was younger, slimmer, sitting his horse with less confidence. Probably Thomas Reed, a cowhand who worked Pike's newly acquired cattle range to pay off gambling debts that grew faster than he could work. Their voices drifted across the distance, made tinny by heat and space, but still audible in the stillness. Hale's got 6 men out searching. Buck's voice carried spite and pain together. Pike's offering $20 for information leading to their capture, $40 for bringing them in alive. That's more than I make in 3 months. $40 for an Indian and a farm girl. Tomas sounded genuinely skeptical, like he couldn't quite believe the numbers. That's serious money. More than most folks see in half a year. It ain't about them specifically, you fool. It's about showing what happens when you cross Harlan Pike. Buck spat the sound carrying clearly across the gap. Word gets around that some Lakota can steal a man's property and walk away, next thing every debtor in the territory thinks they can do the same. Pike's got to make an example public and brutal and permanent, or his whole system falls apart like a house of cards. Still seems like a lot of money for... Just do your job, Reed. Pike's covering my gambling debts at the saloon if I bring him back. You got your own debts he's holding over your head. We both got reasons to find them before sundown. The hoofbeats faded north toward town, leaving silence broken only by wind through dead grass. Dakota waited a full 5 minutes by internal count, measuring breaths and heartbeats, before speaking in barely more than a whisper. $20 and $40. That will motivate half the territory's drifters and most of Hale's so-called deputies. Greta's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping. Pike has money from all those foreclosures, years of them. He can afford to pay bounties for weeks if he wants, and he'll want to. This is about power, not economics. But money means records. Ledgers showing who he paid and for what going back years. Debt notes showing whose land he stole. If those disappeared or became public knowledge, he would lose proof of ownership claims. Dakota finished following her logic with growing excitement. Land titles would become disputable. Debts would be unenforceable without documentation. His whole operation depends on those records being secure and appearing legitimate. I know locks, Greta said abruptly, decision made. At Dakota's questioning look, she explained quickly, words tumbling out. When I was 12 to 14, I apprenticed metalwork in secret. Told Conrad I was mending clothes at the seamstress's house, but really, I was at the town smithy at night, after the smith went home, watching through windows, studying how he worked. Then practicing when he wasn't there. Locks are mechanically simple, just pins and springs and levers. The hard part is picking them without being seen or leaving marks that show tampering. Dakota reassessed everything he'd assumed about the quiet Swedish woman he'd watched carrying water buckets and haggling over cornmeal prices, seeing her now with new eyes. "You have tools?" Greta reached down and tore open a seam in her hem that she'd carefully resewn countless times, pulling out a small leather pouch no bigger than her palm, worn soft with age and handling. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth precision files, a bent all-fine pliers, and a hooked wire she'd fashioned herself years ago from a broken wagon spring. Conrad never knew these existed. "I've kept them hidden since I was 14 after the first time he hit me drunk, and I realized I might need to run someday. These are insurance. Freedom, if I was ever brave enough to use them." For the first time since the chaos of the auction, Dakota smiled a brief, genuine expression that transformed his scarred face from hard and dangerous to almost young, showing the man he might have been without survival etching lines into skin. "You plan to rob Pike's office." "I plan to survive with freedom intact," Greta corrected. "Pike's ledgers go missing suddenly. Every debt in town becomes disputable, every foreclosure questionable. His authority fragments into chaos and legal challenges. That chaos is cover we can use to disappear properly, maybe make it to Prescott, where the territorial marshal might actually listen to our version instead of Hale's lies." She looked at him directly, blue eyes, fierce with determination. "But I need help. Someone who can watch for trouble while I work the lock and search for the right documents. Someone who knows how to move quietly and fight if things go wrong." "Why trust me?" The question was honest, not rhetorical or self-deprecating. Dakota genuinely wanted to understand. Greta was silent for several heartbeats, staring at her freed wrists with their ring of raw rope burns that would scar. When she finally spoke, her voice carried weight of years. "On that crate when Buck had the knife to my hair, and everyone else was just watching like it was normal, like selling people was just another day. You asked what I wanted. You didn't tell me to be quiet or accept my fate or think of Conrad's needs. You asked me." She raised her eyes to his, holding his gaze. "No one has asked me what I wanted in 19 years. And then you could have walked away. When Pike started making threats, could have decided it wasn't worth the trouble or the risk. But you didn't. You stayed and you fought. That's more trust than Conrad earned in 2 decades. Dakota considered this carefully, turning it over in his mind. Trust was a commodity he'd bartered very little of since his own Lakota band had cast him out for refusing to participate in a raid on a settler wagon train last winter. Not because he loved whites, but because he couldn't see how killing families trying to survive made his people's survival more likely. But there was cold logic in alliance here. 2 people had significantly better survival odds than one in hostile territory, where bounty hunters would soon be searching every canyon and waterhole. And there was something else too, something harder to name or quantify, the memory of her standing on that crate, with her chin held high, despite bound hands, and a knife at her throat, refusing to break, choosing to resist, even when resistance looked suicidal. "The watch I offered, Pike." Dakota said, shifting subjects, but not really building trust through shared information. "Did you see it clearly?" "Only for a moment before everything went to chaos. Silver, old tarnished." "Why?" Dakota pulled it from his pouch, where he'd somehow managed to reclaim it during the panicked scramble to escape years of keeping valuables close, even in crisis. "I bought this 2 weeks ago from a dying man I found on the trail north of here. Fever had taken him, probably cholera from bad water, and he had no family, no possessions, except this watch and the clothes he wore. He was delirious most of the time, speaking German. I didn't fully understand. My missionary teacher taught me English, but not German. But he kept touching this watch like it was the most important thing in the world, like it held his whole life. He opened the back casing carefully with a thumbnail, revealing the watch's mechanical works. Inside, wedged beside the delicate gears and springs, was a tarnished military medal of some kind, and a folded paper that crackled with age when touched. Dakota unfolded it with careful fingers, treating it like it might disintegrate. The paper was brittle and yellowed, covered in German text, printed in official Gothic script that looked like it had been stamped by government bureaucracy. Greta leaned close her shoulder, brushing his in the tight space of the culvert as she struggled to make out the words in the dimness under the cottonwood roots. The physical contact sent unexpected warmth through her, despite the heat, a connection that felt important in ways she couldn't name. Haftbefehl. She read slowly, her pronunciation uncertain but comprehensible, dredging up half-remembered words from hearing Conrad speak. Arrest warrant. For desertion from Prussian military service during the border conflicts with Denmark. She pointed to a name that was smudged, but still partially legible. Issued in Hamburg, 1853, 20 years ago. This is a fugitive notice for someone who fled conscription and made it to America somehow. Is this common? Dakota asked. Men carrying evidence of their own crimes across an ocean. For deserters sometimes. Greta said, her mind clearly racing through implications, connecting dots that had been invisible moments before. Prussian conscription was brutal years of service, terrible conditions, beatings for minor infractions. Many men deserted when they could and fled to America with forged papers and new names. But they'd keep the original warrant hidden sometimes, maybe as proof of identity if they ever tried to go back, or as insurance, or just as a reminder of what they'd escaped. She paused, realization dawning across her face, like sunrise breaking over mountains. Conrad deserted. From the Prussian army. That's why he changed his name from Conrad Weiss to Conrad Anderson and claimed to be Swedish when he's actually Prussian-German. I heard him speaking German this morning when he was angry, not Swedish. And somehow Pike knows about it. That's the leverage. Pike threatens to report Conrad to federal authorities if the debts aren't paid, and desertion from a foreign military service can still get you deported or imprisoned here. One deserter wouldn't interest Pike enough to build this elaborate system of control. Dakota said, slowly, thinking it through with the careful logic of a hunter tracking prey. But if there were many, if Pike somehow helped them enter America, illegally documented their real identities, then systematically tracked them westward and blackmailed them once they'd established farms or businesses or put down roots, he let the implication hang heavy in the hot air between them. Greta's eyes widened, pupils dilating with the shock of understanding. A network. Not just Conrad, how many others, farmers, shopkeepers, miners, freight haulers, all of them trapped by Pike because he knows secrets that could destroy their lives. If we can prove Pike is blackmailing multiple deserters and that he profited from smuggling them into the country in the first place, the territorial authorities might actually act. That's federal crime, human trafficking, extortion across state lines. They'd have to investigate even if Pike owns the local law. But we need his records. Dakota pointed out, always practical. And we need solid proof of his crimes before we can approach any authority safely, because Hale will arrest us on sight the moment we show our faces in town or on any road. A new sound interrupted their planning. Not hoofbeats this time, but a woman's voice calling softly from upstream, where the creek bed curved around an outcropping, the words careful and measured, like someone afraid of being overheard. If anyone's hiding down here and listening, I brought water and food. I'm leaving it by the old snag tree with the lightning scar, the dead one that stands alone. Take it if you need it. I'm going now. Greta recognized that voice, instantly relief flooding through her. Ruth Fallon, the school teacher. She's a good woman widow from Ohio who came west after the war. They waited motionless in their hiding place until the sound of careful footsteps retreated completely. measuring seconds by heartbeats, then cautiously emerged from the culvert's shelter. Near a twisted dead cottonwood that had been struck by lightning years ago and stood like a charred sentinel, they found a canvas sack containing 2 full canteens of cool water hardtack wrapped in cloth-dried beef that looked fresh, and a note written in careful schoolteacher script on the back of a torn arithmetic worksheet. They searched my schoolhouse thoroughly and found nothing but Sheriff Hale is watching me, now has a deputy stationed across the street. Pike has threatened Dr. Ephraim Cole with foreclosure on his medical clinic for speaking out against the auction, called it interfering with lawful commerce. The whole town is frightened, more frightened than I've ever seen. Whatever you're planning, do it quickly. People will turn on you to protect themselves and their families when the pressure gets high. Enough fear makes cowards of even good people. God keep you both safe. R.F. Greta pocketed the note carefully, folding it small. We have at least one ally. Maybe 2 if Cole stays brave, despite the threats hanging over him. Dakota chewed a piece of the hardtack, slowly thinking through logistics and timing with the methodical care of someone whose life had often depended on good planning. Tonight, then, after full dark, when the moon sets. Pike keeps late hours at his office doing bookkeeping. I've seen the lamplight burning in his window when I've camped near town trading. After midnight, the settlement sleeps, except for whoever Hale has on patrol. I can approach from the back alley through the storage shed that connects to his main building. I pick the office lock, find the main ledger and any correspondence that proves the smuggling operation, and we meet back at this stamp mill you mentioned by dawn with evidence in hand. Greta finished matter-of-factly, as if they were planning a simple supply run instead of a robbery that could get them killed or hanged. Then she took a step, and her ankle twisted painfully on a loose rock hidden in shadow. She hissed in pain through clenched teeth, catching herself against the limestone wall. Dakota was kneeling beside her, instantly hands hovering respectfully. "May I examine it?" She nodded, and he probed her ankle carefully with gentle fingers that somehow knew exactly where to check for breaks or serious sprains. "Swelling starting already. You twisted it badly during the run, and the adrenaline masked the pain until now. You cannot run 3 more miles on this tonight, not through rough country." "I can walk carefully." Greta insisted, but even she could hear the doubt in her own voice. "Not fast enough through rough country in darkness while dodging patrols." He was already tearing a strip from his shirt, already ragged from the day's chaos, and wrapping her ankle with practiced efficiency, the movements of someone who dressed wounds before, probably many times in a hard life. His hands were warm against her skin, calloused but surprisingly gentle, and somehow the care he took made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You rest here today. Stay hidden in shade. I'll scout the town after sundown, watch Pike's routine, and memorize the patrol patterns Hale has set up. Tomorrow night, we act together when you can move properly." Greta wanted to argue, hated feeling like a burden or weakness in a plan that required speed and silence. But the pain shooting up her calf with each heartbeat convinced her. "If they find me here alone while you're gone." "They will not," Dakota said with flat certainty that left no room for doubt. "I know this land, every draw and shadow and game trail, every place water might collect, every route riders would take. They don't. They're settlers who stick to roads and marked paths, who fear the wilderness more than they should. I can move through country they think is empty and be invisible doing it." He finished the wrap with a neat knot, his palm resting briefly on her knee to test the binding's stability and tension, checking his work with professional care. In the tight space of the culvert, with afternoon heat pressing down like a physical weight, their faces were only inches apart, breath mingling in air that tasted of dust and fear and something else, possibility maybe, or the beginning of trust that went deeper than tactical necessity. "Why are you doing this?" Greta asked quietly, needing to understand the man who'd upended her life in the space of an hour. Really? You could disappear into the mountains or the canyons right now, travel for days through country where no white man could follow, and they would never find you. You'd be safe. But instead, you're here planning a robbery that could get you killed. Why? Dakota's answer came after a long pause, as if he was choosing words carefully from a language that didn't quite have the terms he needed. You were being broken, like a tool that's bent wrong and needs hammering into a shape that serves its owner's purpose. Tools have purpose determined by others. A hammer drives nails, a saw cuts wood, neither chooses its use. But people choose their own purpose, or they should be able to. That's what makes us human instead of objects. His dark eyes held hers steadily, not looking away. You chose to refuse on that crate even when refusing looked like it might get you killed right there in front of everyone. That choice matters. It's worth protecting, worth fighting for even at cost to myself. Greta felt something shift deep in her chest, a small crack appearing in the wall she'd built around herself brick by brick over the years, ever since she'd realized Conrad saw her only as unpaid labor and an outlet for drunken rage. Dakota saw her as a person who made choices that mattered, whose will and voice and decisions had weight in the world. The difference was as vast as the desert sky above them. When this is finished, she said slowly, testing the words, when Pike is dealt with one way or another, where will you go? I don't know, Dakota admitted with surprising candor. My people don't want me back. I'm a traitor in their eyes for refusing to kill settlers, for questioning whether violence against innocents serves any purpose. But the settlers will want me hanged for this, for disrupting their precious order and laws that only seem to protect some people. Maybe Mexico down past the border, where nobody knows my face, and Lakota are just Lakota, not individuals with histories. He smiled faintly, the expression sad around the edges. Where will you go? I don't know either, Greta said, and felt the weight of that truth settle over her like a blanket. I've spent 19 years going exactly where I was told to go, doing exactly what I was ordered to do, never questioning, because questioning got you hit or locked in the root cellar without food. I've never chosen a destination in my life. Never even let myself imagine what I'd choose if I could, because imagining just made the reality harder. They sat in silence as shadows lengthened, and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Two people without homes or futures, cast out by their respective worlds, making dangerous plans to dismantle the power of a man who'd stolen homes and futures from dozens of families over the course of years. It was audacious and possibly suicidal, and flew in the face of every survival instinct that screamed to run far and fast. It was also the first truly free decision either had made in years, and that made all the difference. That realization settled between them like a third presence, unnamed but acknowledged. And when Dakota finally stood to begin his scouting mission, Greta caught his hand briefly. Be careful, she said simply. Always. He replied. And then he was gone, moving through the cottonwoods like smoke, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the slowly cooling air as evening approached. Greta used the solitude to think, to plan, to prepare herself mentally for what would come. She examined her tools by fading light, testing each one, making sure nothing had been damaged in the chaos of escape. The files were still sharp, if the aul's point still true, the hooked wire still had spring and flex. These tools were more than metal and wood. They were freedom and capability, and the accumulated skills of 2 years spent learning in secret. She thought about Conrad's words that morning, spoken in anger, but revealing truth. I pulled you from that cholera camp, from those pastors. Not I adopted you legally, not I saved you as family, but I pulled you, like pulling a tool from a bin, claiming it for use. The phrasing had bothered her all day, gnawing at the back of her mind, even through the terror and flight. And then there was Pike's ledger, the one Dakota said existed. If Pike was blackmailing Conrad about desertion, what else was in those records? What other secrets? What other lies? She must have dozed despite her intentions, because she woke to full darkness and Dakota's quiet return. He moved so silently, she only knew he was there when he spoke softly near her ear. Pike posted notices on every building in town. Dakota reported settling beside her in the darkness. $20 for information on a kidnapped woman named Greta Anderson held against her will by a dangerous Lakota named Dakota, who was killed before. $40 for my capture with a warning that I'm armed and will murder anyone who tries to help you. Your Conrad signed an official statement with his mark, claiming, I threatened him with a knife and abducted you by force, while he tried desperately to stop me and save his beloved daughter. Greta's laugh was sharp and humorless, bitter as alkali water. Of course he did. Pike probably paid him extra for the right wording, made sure it sounded legal and proper, and tugged at heartstrings. Conrad never could resist easy money, especially when it came in a bottle. Dr. Cole protested loudly at the saloon tonight. Dakota continued, called the whole thing a travesty of justice, and said any fool with eyes could see you'd refused consent publicly. Pike threatened to foreclose on his clinic immediately and have him run out of the territory on a rail unless he kept his mouth shut and stopped stirring up trouble. Cole left angry, but hasn't said anything more publicly. Can't blame him. He has a wife and patients depending on him. Dakota paused, and in the darkness, Greta could hear the weight in his silence. The town is choosing sides, and most are choosing survival over justice. Can't blame them really when Pike controls their livelihoods and their futures. Fear is a powerful thing. Then we move tonight, not tomorrow, when your ankle's better. Greta said decisively, testing her weight on the injured joint. It hurt sharp and immediate, but the swelling had gone down slightly with rest, and the wrap held firm. Every hour we wait is another hour for Pike to consolidate power, spread his version of events, turn more people against us. We go tonight. Your ankle will serve well enough, Greta interrupted with finality. I've worked full days on worse. Pain is temporary. Missing our chance is permanent. We go tonight and we do it right. Dakota studied her in the starlight for a long moment, then slowly nodded with clear respect in the gesture. There's a complication you should know about. Hale has stationed a deputy behind Pike's office building now, watching the back entrance with a carbine and strict orders to shoot anyone suspicious. It's Buck Wiley nursing his sore wrist and looking for revenge, and that $40 bounty. Greta absorbed this unwelcome information, mind already working through the new problem. Can you draw him away, create a distraction elsewhere? Possibly if I'm clever and lucky. But then I can't be two places at once. If I'm creating noise and movement on one side of town to pull Buck away, you're alone picking that lock with nobody watching your back or warning you if something goes wrong. That was always the essential plan, Greta pointed out reasonably. One person picks locks, one person watches. Now we just need to be more creative about the watching part. They stared at each other in the darkness, broken only by starlight, neither willing to abandon the attempt, but both recognizing the escalating danger, the way the odds kept getting worse. Finally, Greta spoke, thinking aloud, in the way she sometimes did when working through a mechanical problem. What if we don't go through Pike's office entrance at all, front or back? The ledgers are in his office safe. Safes are in offices, yes, but offices share walls with other rooms. Greta interrupted her mind, working through the building's layout from memory, from all the times she'd carried Conrad's purchases. I've been in Pike's mercantile dozens of times over the years, carrying supplies from the storage room to our wagon. The office is attached to the main mercantile building, shares the entire north wall. If we enter through the mercantile storage room, instead of trying either office door. She was talking faster now, excitement building as the plan took shape. The storage room lock is much simpler than the office, just a basic padlock instead of a keyed deadbolt, the kind I could pick in under 2 minutes. Less visible from the street because it's around back. We go through the shared wall instead of through any door. It's just old pine planks, probably 3/4-inch board, dry and brittle from this heat. We could quietly pry boards loose, reach through into the office, grab what we need, and escape the same way we came in. No one watches an interior wall. We'd need tools for that. Dakota said, but she could hear growing interest in his voice. A pry bar at minimum. Probably a saw to cut through nails if they're stubborn. Pike's storage room has a complete set of carpenter's tools in there right now. Greta said, her smile grim and satisfied in the darkness. He foreclosed on Jed Mallory's carpentry business last month, took everything, including tools that had been Jed's father's and grandfather's before that. Family tools, 3 generations of craftsmanship. We use Pike's own theft to rob Pike. There's a certain justice in that. You're certain about the shared wall's location? Absolutely certain. I helped Conrad load supplies from that storage room a dozen times over the past year as his debt grew. The north wall has old nail holes where shelves used to hang, before Pike renovated and expanded his office last year, took over what had been storage space. It's load-bearing for the roof structure, yes, but the planks themselves are old pine, probably original construction from 10 years ago. Dry and brittle from this endless drought. 2 people working carefully could pry them loose in under an hour if we're methodical and quiet about it. It was audacious and risky and exactly the kind of plan that might work precisely because nobody would expect it. Because Pike's arrogance wouldn't let him imagine someone targeting an interior wall. Dakota's smile came again in the darkness, the second time Greta had seen it. And it transformed his entire face from hard and dangerous to almost boyish, showing glimpses of who he might have been in a kinder world. Tonight, then, he agreed with finality. We wait for the moon to set completely. That gives us true darkness, maybe 3 hours of deep night before dawn starts graying the sky. Enough time if we're fast and careful. They spent the intervening hours in careful preparation that felt almost ritual. Dakota scouted the settlement's perimeter one more time, while Greta tested her ankle with increasingly demanding movements, pushing through pain to make sure she could move when necessary. The joint was swollen and tender, but functional enough if she was careful. She'd worked through worse. When Dakota returned, he reported that Hale's deputies made patrol rounds every 40 minutes, with the predictability of clockwork increasingly lazy and perfunctory as the night wore on and nothing happened. Human nature vigilance was hard to maintain. Ruth Fallon had left another sack at the lightning-scarred snag tree, this one containing men's work clothes in rough sizes that might fit. Greta changed out of her torn dress into canvas trousers that were far too large and had to be belted tight with rope and a work shirt she had to roll the sleeves on 3 times. The clothes smelled of sweat and labor, but they were sturdy, and more importantly, they let her move freely without fighting skirts. She pinned her distinctive blonde hair up tight and covered it with a battered wide-brimmed hat that hid her features. In darkness, from any distance, she might pass for a ranch hand or drifter, just another man in a territory full of them. When the thin crescent moon finally set behind the western mountains, and true darkness fell like a curtain, they moved with purpose, born of necessity. The route Dakota chose avoided the main street entirely, circling wide through empty prairie to approach Ash Fork Crossing from the north, where scattered homesteads gave way to the settlement's ragged edge. They moved in silence that felt companionable rather than tense. Greta keeping as much weight off her wrapped ankle as possible, gripping Dakota's arm when the terrain turned treacherous with hidden rocks and sudden dips that could break an ankle worse. His steadiness became her balance, his certainty, her courage, his knowledge of the land, her safety. The mercantile storage shed was a low structure built directly against the main building's north wall, far from the street's oil lamps and the saloon's lantern-lit windows, where late drinkers still laughed and argued. A single padlock secured the door, newer and heavier than Greta had expected, possibly a recent upgrade after some previous theft or Pike's growing paranoia about his expanding empire. She knelt in the dust, pulling her precious tools from their pouch with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. She wouldn't allow it. She began working by feel alone, since any light risked discovery, even a match struck for a second. Her fingers found the keyhole, explored its shape and size, selected the right pick from her small collection by touch and long familiarity. Dakota crouched beside her, facing outward, body positioned to shield her work from any casual glance. Watching the shadows and listening to the night sounds with the focused attention of a man whose life had often depended on noticing what didn't belong. A dog barking somewhere in the distance, boots on boardwalk 2 streets over the saloon piano playing badly through an open window. Minutes stretched like hours. Sweat gathered on Greta's forehead despite the cool night air ran down her spine. The lock was better made than she'd hoped, with pins that caught and held stubbornly, resisting her probing picks. She forced herself to work slowly, methodically, feeling for the tiny clicks that meant progress, resisting the urge to rush that would only cause mistakes and wasted time. The lock finally yielded with a soft snick that sounded explosively loud, in the silence metal surrendering to patient skill. They slipped inside, easing the door shut behind them with aching slowness to avoid any scrape or squeak of hinges. The storage room was cramped and utterly dark, smelling of sawdust and leather, and the distinctive scent of raw wool and lamp oil. Dakota struck a match with his thumbnail, cupping the flame carefully so it wouldn't show through any crack to outside eyes. In the flickering yellow light that created dancing shadows, rows of confiscated goods, lined, crude shelving furniture that had belonged to foreclosed families, tools marked with other men's names, carved into handles, crates stenciled with the names of businesses that no longer existed in Ash Fork Crossing. The physical evidence of Pike's systematic theft over years, all stored here like trophies of conquest, spoils of a quiet war waged with paper and debt instead of bullets. Greta spotted Jed Mallory's carpenter tools hanging on pegs along the far wall. She recognized them immediately by the carved initials JM on the saw handle, the distinctive wear pattern on the hammer, from years of skilled use. She took a small handsaw and a flat pry bar, testing their weight and balance, with the automatic assessment of someone who understood tools at a fundamental level. The shared wall was exactly where she remembered, 8 feet wide and running floor to ceiling, showing faint lines of light through the cracks between planks from the oil lamp Pike habitually left burning low in his office overnight, a waste of oil. But then Pike could afford to waste what others couldn't. Through the gaps, they could hear nothing from beyond, no movement or breathing. Pike must have gone home hours ago, leaving just that lamp burning, as he always did, afraid of darkness, or perhaps just marking his territory. Greta positioned the saw blade carefully at the very base of the lowest plank, where shadows would hide the cut even in daylight if someone happened to look. Slowly, she breathed, barely audible, even in the enclosed space. Steady pressure let the saw do the work. They worked in coordinated silence that required no words. Greta sawing with careful, controlled strokes, Dakota bracing the plank with his hands to prevent vibration that might sound through the wall or create noticeable movement. The saw teeth bit into dry pine with soft whispers, each stroke controlled and deliberate, patient as a hunter waiting for prey. 5 minutes crawled by. 10. Greta's shoulders began to burn with the awkward angle and sustained effort muscles screaming. Sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging. A crack sounded too loud, like breaking bone in the silence. They froze instantly, barely breathing bodies going rigid. Footsteps approached from inside the office boots on wooden floorboards that creaked under weight. The lamp's light shifted, strengthened, as someone lifted it to see better. "Who's there?" Sheriff Hale's voice, suspicious and fully alert, not slurred with sleep or drink. "I know someone's skulking around. Show yourself." They hadn't counted on Hale staying late to guard the office personally, probably sleeping in Pike's chair with a bottle, or maybe Pike had ordered him to stand watch after the day's chaos. Either way, they were trapped. Greta's mind raced frantically through options: run, hide, fight, and all of them were terrible death or capture the only outcomes. Dakota's hand found hers in the utter darkness and squeezed once, conveying without words, "Stay absolutely still and silent. Don't even breathe if you can help it." Hale's boots creaked on the office floorboards, approaching the shared wall step by heavy step. He was checking, listening, perhaps looking for visual signs of disturbance in the shadows. If he noticed the fresh saw marks in the plank, if he heard them breathing just 8 inches away through the wall's thickness. A new voice called from outside in the street, young and nervous. "Sheriff Hale, got something suspicious at the pump house. Looks like someone's been tampering with the lock, tried to pry it open." Hale cursed with creative vulgarity that would have made a mule skinner proud. "This better not be another blamed coyote knocking things over looking for water, Thomas Reed, or I swear I'll have your worthless hide tacked to Pike's wall as a lesson." His footsteps retreated from the wall. The office door slammed hard enough to rattle windows, and they heard him stomp heavily down the Mercantile's front steps toward the street, still cursing. Greta and Dakota exhaled together in perfect unison, long, shuddering breaths, not having realized they'd both been holding air in burning lungs. They had perhaps 5 minutes before Hale returned, maybe less, if the pump house turned out to be nothing but Thomas's nervous imagination or an actual scavenging coyote. "Stealth is over." Dakota murmured, decision made. "Now we rush and hope speed beats discovery." They abandoned all pretense of caution for pure speed. Greta sawed hard and fast, the blade biting deep, while Dakota pried with the iron bar, and the plank suddenly gave way entirely with a crack that seemed thunderous in the enclosed space, loud enough to wake the dead. They both flinched instinctively, waiting for shouts and gunfire and the end of everything. None came. The pump house distraction was holding probably Thomas, checking on actual damage from some drunk or genuine animal, giving them precious seconds. Through the gap they'd created, they could see directly into Pike's office, lit by that single oil lamp. Turned low, a large desk covered in scattered papers and account books, a locked cabinet against the far wall, probably holding cash or weapons. And on a side shelf within reach, 3 leather-bound ledger's spines, labeled in neat script with dates spanning years. Dakota reached through the gap arm, extended, fully straining fingers, stretching. Too far by crucial inches. He withdrew, looked at Greta with frustration, clear in his eyes, even by lamplight. "You're smaller. Longer reach relative to shoulder width." Her frame was smaller than his, by necessity of birth, but her arm was also 2 inches shorter than his by measurement. Simple geometry said this shouldn't work. But she had something else, the hooked wire from her lock-picking tools designed for exactly this kind of problem, for reaching things that shouldn't be reachable. Greta thrust her arm through the gap up to her shoulder, wood-scraping skin, raw wire extended like a fishing line, cast toward hope. She snagged the nearest ledger's spine with the hook on her 3rd try, pulled gently, afraid of dropping it and making noise. The book tilted, slid forward an inch. She caught the edge with her fingertips and dragged it slowly through the gap leather spine, scraping against rough wood, with sounds that seemed catastrophically loud. "Got it." She handed the ledger to Dakota with shaking hands, immediately reached for the second without pausing. Outside, Hale's voice rose sharply, anger clear. "There's nothing here but coyote tracks. Thomas, you wasted my time with..." Wait, what was that noise from inside? They were out of time, seconds from discovery and death, or worse. Greta grabbed the second ledger and yanked hard, abandoning any pretense of stealth. It came through, but knocked hard against a stack of papers precariously balanced on Pike's desk. An ink bottle wobbled, teetered on the edge for an eternal heartbeat, and shattered across legal documents with a sound like a gunshot in the silence glass and ink exploding together. What in blazes there in the storage room? They came through the damned wall. Hale was running back toward the building, his voice rising to a shout. Buck Thomas cut them off at the north alley. They're escaping with the ledgers. Go! Dakota shoved Greta toward the storage shed door, not gentle but not rough, just urgent. She stumbled on her injured ankle. She'd forgotten about it entirely in the intensity of the moment, and pain shot through her leg like lightning. But she bit back any sound and hobbled forward as fast as she could move, clutching both ledgers against her chest like they were children needing protection. Behind them, the storage door crashed open. With splintering force, the lock they'd so carefully picked, now meaningless, as Hale simply shouldered through rotten wood. A pistol shot boomed shockingly loud, and the bullet thunked into a fence post inches from Greta's head, close enough that she felt the air pressure of its passage. Splinters of wood stung her cheek, drawing blood. Dakota pulled her hard left into the narrow gap between two buildings, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, their shoulders scraping both walls. They forced through buttons, catching on rough wood lungs burning. Behind them, boots pounded hard and close. Another shot, even closer this time. Greta felt the bullet's passage as a pressure wave against her ear, felt the heat of it. Her borrowed hat flew off, carried away by the near miss. They burst onto a side street, sprinting desperately toward the prairie's protective darkness beyond the settlement's edge. Hale was shouting for his deputies in a voice gone hoarse with rage, multiple voices converging from different directions like wolves closing on wounded prey. Lanterns bobbed in the night like malevolent fireflies getting closer. They had 50 yards lead on foot, then 40 as younger men started closing the distance, then 30 as their own exhaustion began to tell. Dakota yanked Greta down hard, behind a water trough, as two mounted riders thundered past at full gallop, horses' hooves, throwing sparks from stones, not seeing the fugitives crouched in the deep moon shadow cast by a building's overhang. Pressed together in the tiny space, hearts hammering so hard they could feel each other's pulse. Through pressed shoulders, they waited in frozen silence that stretched forever. The riders turned at the settlement's edge, confused by darkness and contradictory shouts, searching the wrong direction entirely because they'd overshot their quarry's position in their haste and fury. Now, Dakota breathed directly against Greta's ear, his voice barely more than shaped air. They crawled on hands and knees through tall grass, growing along an irrigation ditch, moving like animals, then ran hunched over, using every scrap of cover, until the settlement's lights were distant sparks behind them, until the night swallowed them whole. When they finally stopped in a dry wash 2 miles out, collapsing against the sandy bank, like puppets with cut strings, Greta was shaking. Not from fear exactly. Not anymore, but from adrenaline and exhaustion. And something that felt almost like savage exhilaration, like victory against impossible odds. "We did it," she gasped, hardly believing the words, even as she spoke them. "We actually did it. We robbed Harlan Pike and lived." Dakota examined the ledgers by starlight, hands remarkably steady, given what they'd just survived, given how close they'd come to death or capture. The first was filled with page after page of debt records, foreclosures, and names at least 40 families marked with amounts owed and dates. And beside many entries in Pike's own careful hand, paid with amounts, but then the balances never adjusted downward. Payment after payment recorded, but never credited, mathematical fraud on every page. Greta found Conrad's entry halfway through, and her breath caught. Anderson C. 40 acres, Section 12 tools, livestock seed. Original debt, $127. paid to date 83, current balance due $127. The payments were meticulously recorded in one column, but completely deliberately ignored in the balance calculation theft made mathematically pure. But it was the second ledger that made her blood run cold. Correspondence in German letters with Hamburg Shipping Company stamps dating back to 1853. And there, in a letter from Pike to his contact in Hamburg, dated 1856, a line that made her vision narrow. The Anderson package traveling with orphan child female Greta A. arrived safely. Your concern about adoption papers is noted. There are none, and I advised him to claim verbal agreement with deceased pastor. Courthouse records here are easily managed. Such complications make these packages more profitable for future leverage. No legal claim means permanent control. Greta read it 3 times, each time the words hitting harder. No adoption papers. Pike had known from the start. Had advised Conrad to lie. Had seen her as leverage before she'd even understood what that word meant. This is proof. Dakota said quietly, something like awe in his voice as he scanned other pages. Pike has been running this smuggling and blackmail operation since before the war ended. 20 years of systematic theft and human trafficking, all documented in his own hand. Greta touched the ledger with trembling fingers, hardly daring to believe they'd actually succeeded in getting this far. Then we can end him. We can actually end him and free everyone he's trapped, everyone he's been crushing. But Dakota's expression was troubled, his scarred face thoughtful in the starlight that was already beginning to gray toward dawn. Proof means nothing if we can't reach someone with real authority who isn't already Pike's creature or too afraid to act. Hale won't listen. He's part of the conspiracy, probably blackmailed himself. The territorial marshal is in Prescott, 80 miles of open country, where everyone will be hunting us for those bounty rewards. We can't exactly send these by mail and hope they arrive safely. Pike controls the postal agent here. Greta sat back against the wash's sandy wall, exhaustion crashing over her like a physical wave now that the immediate danger had passed. Her ankle throbbed with vicious intensity. Her shoulders ached from the sawing. Her hands were blistered and bleeding from the rough work and the desperate escape. And yet, despite all of it, despite the impossible situation they were in for the first time in her adult life, she had actively chosen to fight instead of merely enduring, had taken concrete action to change her circumstances instead of just surviving them day by day, accepting whatever came as inevitable. "We'll find a way," she said with absolute conviction, looking at Dakota and seeing her own fierce determination reflected back. "We have to. Too many people are trapped by him, suffering in silence. We didn't risk all this just to run away and hide while Pike keeps destroying lives and families like it's his right." Dakota looked at her in the starlight, blonde hair falling loose from its careful pinning face smudged with dirt and blood, clothes torn and filthy eyes fierce despite obvious pain and exhaustion. She looked like a warrior. He thought like someone who'd been tested by fire and hadn't broken. He reached into his pack, moving slowly and deliberately, and pulled out a narrow strip of soft buckskin he'd carried for years. "For luck," he said quietly, wrapping it around her wrist and tying it with a simple knot that somehow felt significant, almost ceremonial. His fingers lingered against her pulse point for a heartbeat longer than strictly necessary, feeling her blood beat strong and steady under skin, feeling the life in her that Pike had tried to auction away. Greta met his eyes, saw something there beyond tactical alliance or shared danger, something she'd never expected to see in another person's face when they looked at her. Something uncertain and new and frightening in its vulnerability, the possibility of genuine connection, of trust that went deeper than survival necessity, of mattering to someone, not for what she could do, but for who she was. "Thank you," she said quietly. Meaning it for everything, the intervention at the auction that had changed everything, the protection during their flight, the partnership in this impossible robbery. And now this small gesture of something she didn't quite have words for yet, but knew was precious. They settled into the wash to rest until dawn, and the precious ledgers wrapped carefully in Greta's borrowed shirt and placed between them two people against an entire town and its corrupt power structure. The odds were objectively terrible, mathematically impossible. But they were not alone in this fight, and they were not broken by what they'd endured. Sometimes that was enough to keep going, to keep fighting, to refuse surrender, even when surrender looked like the only rational choice. Resolution, Prescott, and the ledgers. The sun had slipped to the rim of the high desert when they reached the last ridge before Prescott. Dust hung behind the mule like a tail of smoke, and the town's low roofs showed in broken lines ahead. Greta's wrists were still raw where the rope had burned her skin, but she wrapped them in a strip torn from her calico hem and kept on. Lakota, born to the northern plains and long on the road, walked one stride off her shoulder eyes, moving as if each rock had a pair of eyes of its own. They did not go straight to the courthouse. Dr. Cole had said the one honest way to shift a crooked man was to pin him to paper he could not deny. So first, they turned into the telegraph office. The operator, a thin fellow with ink under his nails, glanced at the rawhide folder and went pale. Dakota laid a calloused finger on the counter and said nothing. Greta wrote the wire slowly, each word like a nail, to U.S. Marshal J.J. Baxter Prescott, evidence of fraud, peonage, false foreclosure by Emery Pike and Justice E. Hale. 2 ledgers enclosed for inspection. Request immediate deputation for safe conveyance. The operator read it twice, swallowed, and tapped it out. They moved next to the office of Mr. Hartley, accountant to 3 mines and 5 banks. Hartley had spectacles like little round windows and a temper for numbers. He did not want trouble, but he wanted correct columns even more. When he saw the pages, German bills of lading from Hamburg tucked between Pike's loan pages interest, compounding on the wrong principle. Foreclosures recorded a month before final notices were served. He sat up straight. This ledger is the theater set, he said, tapping the neat book with the blue ribbon. This other is the backstage. They never meant anyone to see it. He wrote out a short affidavit on the spot, noting the discrepancies and the dates, and signed it with a careful hand. Pike came in at sundown, boot heels loud, a knot of hard boys at his back. He smelled like bay rum and stable dust. "You've got something of mine," he said to Greta, soft as wool. "It came out of my office wall, but it's mine just the same." Hale was a step behind him, face smooth as a plate. The deputy on duty, a boy with a badge too bright for his vest, shifted from one foot to the other. It would have gone bad right then if the telegraph key hadn't started its chatter. The marshal's answer was short: hold parties. Deputize Cole temporary. Keep ledgers sealed. Baxter. The boy deputy straightened like someone had pulled a string in his spine. He took the telegram to the desk, pinned it under a brass weight, and called 2 townsmen to stand witness. Dr. Cole arrived with his black bag and a Winchester older than both deputies. By order of the marshal, he said evenly, "We'll be securing those books." Dakota lifted the rawhide folder and laid it on the desk where everyone could see it. No sudden moves. Let the paper do the cutting. Pike smiled as if he liked the room. "Those are private accounts," he said. "You can't read a man's accounts without his leave." Hartley adjusted his glasses. "False entries, anticipatory foreclosures, duplicate receipts," he replied, tapping the affidavit. "There's no privacy in fraud." Hale tried a different road. "The woman is under labor bond," he said, sliding a sheet across the desk. Fresh ink, careless as a drunk signature. Greta put her shaking finger next to the place where the date had been altered over a scrape. "That's yesterday written over last week," she said. "I was never present." There was no witness but Pike himself. The boy deputy looked at Hale's seal, then at the scraped date, and something in his jaw changed. Outside, the evening wind came up the street. It carried voices the kind men use when they believe they own the daylight. 2 riders from Pike's stable posted at the corner. A third dismounted near the horseshoe rack, left his reins long, and tried the side door. Dakota shifted so that his shoulder cut the angle, and the man decided to try another errand. Baxter did not arrive by miracle. He came at midnight, trail dirty, with 2 marshals and a wagon. The papers went into a tin strongbox with a rattling hasp. The seals slid on with wax that smelled like old candles. Baxter read Hartley's affidavit and the Hamburg letters, then watched Hale while he read them the second time. "Judge," he said without a ripple in his voice, "you'll sit this one out behind the bars until we see daylight." Hale's lips went white, but he held his spine. Pike's smile finally moved. It turned from polite to thin. "You won't make that stick," Pike said. "Men owe me. Land owes me. You can box paper all night. Morning comes, and nothing changes." Morning changed more than Pike liked. Word slid down from the ridge camps that a dozen families had notes just like Greta's. Cole's youngest patient, little Eli, who'd once fetched water for Pike's men, came in, holding a crumpled slip his mother had kept under the stovestone. Hartley found its twin entry in the shadow ledger, money never advanced, interest charged on air foreclosure, stamped 2 weeks before the boy's father had even missed a payment. Baxter sent the second deputy with a stack of summonses and his shotgun laid over his knees. Pike made one try for muscle. His men gathered near the livery where the alley ran to the arroyo. Dakota chose the ground, like he was picking fruit, a tight place, one exit. No line for a horse to drive through. He spoke quietly to the deputy, who was willing to listen, and placed him in the doorway, with the strongbox out of sight. When Pike's first man went for a draw, Dakota didn't reach for glory. He put a warning round into the water trough, sending a white spear of spray into the air, and followed with a shout any ranch hand could understand. "The next one breaks a wrist." It's a hard thing to argue with a man who isn't angry. The second tough decided his pay wasn't worth a tendon. The alley cooled like iron pulled from a forge. By noon, Baxter had a hearing set in the hotel's front room, the only place big enough to hold everyone who had suddenly become interested in paper. Hale tried to object, but there are forms even a judge must keep when a U.S. Marshal is in the room. Witnesses spoke short: Greta on the auction and the rope burns, the storekeeper on the hole in his interior wall and the shelf that hid it, Hartley on the duplicate entries, Cole on bruises recorded and the meaning of a scraped date. Pike's lawyer, a clever man with soft boots, asked if Greta had ever paid a bill late. "I've been late on every bill I ever had," she said evenly, "but not a day before I missed a due date." The room understood that kind of math. Baxter did not thunder. He stacked the facts like cordwood. "False instruments," he said. "Color of law used to coerce labor. Fraud on the mails if these Hamburg letters rode under the postal seal to deceive." He signed a temporary order freezing Pike's foreclosures and relieving Hale of the bench pending territorial review. "We'll carry this to the circuit," he added. "But meanwhile, the ledgers stay where they are." When it was done, Greta sat on the hotel's back steps, elbows on her knees, looking at nothing. Dakota stood in the shade so the light wouldn't stab her eyes. After a time, she said, "If this breaks him, other men will take his place." Dakota nodded once. "Other men have names too," he said. "Paper makes shadows light up." She smiled without showing teeth. "And what do you want?" He looked past her at the line of cottonwoods, cutting sky into strips. "A clean trail for a while," he said. "Then a place where the wind doesn't tell the same lie every day." Cole came around with salve and a grin that didn't reach his tired eyes. "The marshal will need you two to testify again in a fortnight," he said. "Don't go far." He paused, then added, "There's a family out on Lynx Creek, lost half their herd to snakebite and bad grass. They could use hands that don't scare easy." Greta glanced at Dakota. You looking for day wages? She asked, teasing the corners of a smile. He shrugged. I'll trade work for quiet, he said, and a place to sleep where floors don't remember boot heels. That night, Baxter's wagon rolled out with the strongbox bolted to the bed. Hale rode in the second wagon with his hands in front, learning how iron cuffs don't care about titles. Pike watched from his porch, thumb rubbing the rail face lit by the yellow inside his windows. Men like Pike don't believe in endings. They believe in the next angle. But paper and daylight make poor ground for a man who grows in shade. Greta wrapped her wrists with clean linen and tugged her sleeves down. She stood in the doorway of the little room she had rented behind the dressmakers, listening to the hush after the last horse passed. In that quiet, with the town's lamps breathing low, she allowed herself to feel the weight slide off, not gone, but set down where a person could sleep beside it. Dakota leaned against the hitching post outside and looked up at a sky that belonged to no man. Tomorrow, he said almost to the stars, we'll ride at first light. At first light, they did ride east toward Lynx Creek, toward ordinary work that doesn't make a person a ghost in their own life. Behind them, in a tin box that rattled like an old kettle, 2 ledgers and a sheaf of German letters crossed miles of honest road. Ahead of them, the prairie lay the same as ever, patient, exact, and unwilling to remember the names of men who tried to write themselves bigger than the land.